Good morning. I hope you can all hear. I'll raise the mic just a little bit more. What a joy and honor it is to be here with you this morning. I am here because I have a story to tell. Dr. Martin Luther King and my dad were friends. Charlie Walker, my father, worked in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s as an expert trainer in nonviolence for the sit-ins, the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, and the Poor People's Campaign. When I started writing about my dad, I discovered that his story was about a whole movement, a great time in history where nonviolent principles had ascended into a place of honor and respect. I believe it was this staunch commitment to nonviolent methods that earned the movement its success. Dad met and corresponded with Dr. King during the Montgomery bus boycott, developing a warm friendship with him. King wrote in one of his inspiring letters to Charlie, in the last paragraph there, "Let me express my personal appreciation to you for the interest you have taken in our struggle. Such moral support and Christian generosity give us renewed courage and vigor to carry on." So how did my father come to know Martin Luther King, and how was he involved in King's struggle? Well, I want to share with you a story that took place in 1949 when I was just 2 years old. That's me in the middle there. Dad was a pacifist Quaker, and we lived in the Philadelphia area. Charlie Walker was a young man when he first came across Martin Luther King, while King was a student at Crozier Baptist Theological Seminary near Philadelphia. Very few people know that Dr. King, as a young fellow, studied near Philadelphia. He was there for 4 years, and I believe that there was a certain amount of Quaker influence there on him. Now, my father was head of an organization called the Fellowship of Reconciliation, and he was in charge of the Philadelphia FOR, which worked with Reverend King during the civil rights era. Now, part of Dad's job was to visit colleges, so he went to speak in 1949 at Crozier about the brilliant successes of Mahatma Gandhi's use of nonviolence in India. The students became excited about these ideas, and he was so well received that Dad decided to bring his boss from New York, A.J. Musty, to speak at Crozier. And what do you know? There was a young Martin Luther King in that audience. King wrote in his autobiography, Stride Toward Freedom, "During my time at Crozier, I was exposed for the first time to the pacifist position in a lecture by Dr. A.J. Musty. The subject of the talk," Charlie informed us, was the implications of nonviolence for the Christian church. The young King was challenged to ponder what Gandhi's powerful campaigns could offer Christians. Now, after the Musty Walker lecture near Philadelphia, King became fired up about nonviolence. He went out and got every book he could find on the subject and started reading. Because of that life-changing meeting, King trusted A.J. Musty and accepted his and the FOR's help and advice. Reverend King even said, "The success of nonviolence in this country is due more to A.J. than anyone else." Dad was extremely pleased that he had originated, facilitated, and attended that auspicious event. So, here were two white guys who lit a spark in arguably the most important person of the 20th century and helped fan the flames of freedom across this land. Dr. King had this picture taken with Gandhi in the background as part of his commitment to nonviolence. Gandhi had been influenced by Christian missionaries and taught that nonviolence was based on a love force. So that's why you hear King saying things like, again and again we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. King additionally combined Jesus' active love with Gandhi's passive resistance. He was brilliant. Now you would think that the first nonviolent actions would have started in the South and maybe in the 1950s. But they began in the 1940s, and in Chicago, of all places. During World War II, and sponsored by the FOR, a group of black and white students at the University of Chicago, they wanted action. They were young people. They wanted to get things done. They called themselves CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. They developed and conducted training workshops where they invented tactics to test segregation, as they called it. They conducted the first sit-ins in roller rinks, swimming pools, and movie theaters in the 1940s. My dad, at the time, in prison as a conscientious objector to World War II, eagerly read about these brave young people, their innovation making a difference in a world torn by war. Now, after the war, Charlie became head of the Philadelphia FOR, working with and becoming good friends with one of the CORE founders, James Farmer, who had begun his career in the FOR in Chicago. The FOR ended up providing office space, staff, and financial support for CORE for over a decade. So the FOR was kind of like the training wheels for CORE, which became the second major civil rights organization after the NAACP, which was founded in 1909, way before Charlie was born. Now my dad, he helped organize marches with leaders like Jackie Robinson, pictured here, center, with Dad's handsome profile at the right. Jackie had come to Philadelphia he was participating as the Grand Marshal for a youth march for integrated schools. Now, Charlie had his own radio program in the Philadelphia area as the mysterious Mr. Average Citizen. In 1955, on the air on radio WCOJ, a month before the Montgomery bus boycott, Dad imagined, what the South needs today is a black Gandhi, someone who will help in leading the black people to ever-increasing freedom and opportunity, but do it in such a way as will undermine the fear of the white Southerners have, as Gandhi won the confidence of the British. Then the bus boycott began. Here's a photo of people walking to work instead of taking the segregated Montgomery city buses. After Martin Luther King had been thrust into the leadership of the protest, Charlie figured out by then that this was the same young man that he had helped introduce to nonviolence 7 years earlier. Charlie traveled down to Montgomery, where he officially met Dr. King. In one of the amazing mass meetings with an audience of thousands, with many listening outside, Dad was thrilled to hear statements he had heard in CORE and the FOR, such as, "The tension in this city is not between white people and Negro people, but between justice and injustice." Now, black people called themselves Negroes in the 50s and the early 60s. Now, you see, King did not blame people. He blamed the system. And he wanted to change the system so the races could work together. He said, like the true preacher of the gospel that he was, that it was important not to become bitter or hateful, but to approach the situation with love. In our protest, there will be no cross burnings. No white person will be taken from his home at midnight by a hooded Negro mob and brutally murdered. Our actions must be guided by the deepest principles of our Christian faith. Now, Charlie wrote to Reverend King after his visit, "I was immensely impressed during my visit to Montgomery. It was a high moment for me, and indicates the solid spiritual grounding the movement has. Dad was understandably excited about King's leadership of the boycott, writing, "No one is better than King in grasping and voicing the themes of the movement." After he met Dr. King in person, they started a warm and friendly correspondence. Then when Dr. King was victorious after a year of the boycott, Dad's co-worker in the FOR, Glenn Smiley, sat with King on that first integrated bus trip. That's why Glenn later appeared in that famous Encyclopedia Britannica photo right next to Reverend King on that groundbreaking ride. Much correspondence has been preserved between Charles Walker and Martin Luther King in the official papers of Dr. King. At the end of the bus protest, Dad sent a congratulatory telegram, which appears in Volume 3. To Martin Luther King, we honor your struggle on this anniversary. In remaining faithful to nonviolence in thought and action, the people of Montgomery have made new history in America, and a new chapter in the history of freedom has been written. Charles Walker, Fellowship of Reconciliation. Now here is an FOR photo in 1960 of FOR staffers. You might recognize Glenn Smiley because he's right front and center. He was the one who sat next to Reverend King on the bus. Glenn and Dad worked together in Montgomery, and especially later in helping form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, the student arm of the movement, and that might inspire most of you. The SNCC group was just an amazing, wonderful group. And they were the next most important. One of the four major organizations in the civil rights movement was SNCC. Now, you can find Dad in the back row. Maybe you already did, but he's second from the right, and third from the right is Reverend James Lawson. Now, Lawson and Walker both worked with A.J. Musty and Dr. King in forming the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, the fourth major civil rights organization. Now, Reverend Lawson rose in the movement, and he became known as the architect of the civil rights movement. The same year as the photo, Martin Luther King wrote a recommendation letter for a job Charlie was applying for. I mean, who better, if you're applying for a job, you get a reference letter from Martin Luther King. That was really pretty wonderful. And he said, "Mr. Walker has been close to developments in the struggle for racial justice ever since I met him in Montgomery in early 1956. And since Dad was seeking a job in the nonviolence field, King wrote, "It is my settled conviction that the developing and perfection of nonviolent methods in dealing with evil and injustice is of paramount importance." He called Dad a man of skill and understanding. He stated in that letter that King had been a key writer of a training booklet used widely in the movement. He meant this one, published in 1958, A Perspective on Nonviolence. Here on the screen is Martin Luther King looking over the drafts for this pamphlet, along with two other FOR staffers. In this booklet, in defining nonviolence, Charlie said, "Nonviolence is positive, dynamic, direct action, and not to be confused with a program of passive surrender." Perspective lists the 10 benchmarks of nonviolence. Now here is the character of nonviolence: seeking and speaking the truth, looking for constructive solutions, having patience, self-discipline, and willingness to suffer. Additionally, treating the other side with forgiveness, reconciliation, and redemption. Perspective also deals with the 5 steps to the nonviolent approach. Dr. King stressed these over and over again. Investigate. Don't get out on picket lines based on something that you heard on TV. You've got to know what is going on. Know your community and its laws. Negotiate, but make sure that you are talking with the people who have the power to change your situation. If negotiations fail, then have the programs in place to educate the public. Newspaper articles, letters to the editor, get the public involved. Spiritual preparation, as in prayer and training. Then start direct action only if the other 4 steps result in failure. Direct action is only to be used as a last resort. It is not the first thing that you do. And lastly, the 3 levels of nonviolence. The lowest level being techniques. The highest being a spiritual discipline in the hands of God. Now, this level can be hard because Charlie said it requires walking by faith and not by sight. Putting it in the hands of God and obeying his will. But with such beauty, he assures us that God can bless this act of faithfulness beyond human calculation. And there were many times, such as in this photo here, when the 3rd level was put to the test. Martin Luther King and these other leaders led a high-principled movement because they insisted that their only weapon was love, that the movement was based on doing good to your enemies, and praying for those who persecute you. Reverend King urged his followers to remain calm and dignified in Christian love, and to pray for their persecutors even in violent circumstances such as these. King had urged them to pray, saying, "If we fail to do this, our protest will end up as a meaningless drama on the stage of history." He also emphasized, this is a struggle of Black people, but more than Black people. It is a struggle for human dignity everywhere. Dr. King championed the idea of human dignity. All his marches and protests were dignified and unified in prayer. No undignified running through streets, breaking windows, or stealing from stores. No threats, no weapons, and most of all, no retaliation to violence or threats. Everyone was to dress in their Sunday best. Now, all this was based on their belief in their human dignity. They could now look any man or woman in the eye and stand tall because they had not reacted in anger or violence. Following Jesus' example gave them a new sense of freedom and self-worth. King and his leaders were committed to the disciplines of nonviolent direct action. He explained, the nonviolent resistor not only refuses to shoot his opponent, but he also refuses to hate him. He famously said, "Let no man pull you so low as to make you hate him." Reverend King felt the need to pull in allies and supporters like Charlie, who he called his white brothers. And he did bring in allies, particularly for the March on Washington in 1963. I was one of the marchers on that hot August day. My father had helped organize and facilitate that great march. He helped train marshals and urged people to come. His title was Deputy Coordinator for the Philadelphia area under Bayard Rustin, his close friend, who was the deputy director or second in command of the whole march under Philip Randolph, who was the director. Bayard and Charlie were Philadelphia Quakers from the same hometown who worked on numerous projects together in the FOR beginning in 1947. Charlie is in the direct middle, while Bayard is 2 people to the right. A full 1/4 of the people at that march were white, there to show their love and support for the Black people. I was there at the tender age of 15. because my dad was one of the organizers of the march. I got on a school bus early that morning from Philadelphia, and there were lots of buses all over. And the closer we got to Washington, D.C., the more school buses I saw everywhere. I became so excited. I knew this was going to be a great day. I got off the bus at the Washington Memorial, and I was greeted by a marshal who was telling people where to line up. He said, go out into the street and line up black, white, black, white, black, white. They didn't want to have groups of black people, groups of white people. They wanted to show this solidarity. So I was lined up with a bunch of people I didn't know, and I was asked to cross my arms like this as we were marching down the street. And one of the things I really enjoyed was the call and response. One side of the street would yell, freedom, and the other side yelled, now, freedom, now, freedom, now. And we sang freedom songs, which were just so wonderful. Oh, I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on freedom. And another one, ain't gonna let nobody turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. And of course, the anthem of the civil rights movement. We shall overcome. It was such a grand day. And my father, he described it as twin rivers of humanity. That's what he was saying. They looked like twin rivers of humanity heading slowly along Constitution and Independence avenues. I ended up about halfway down the reflecting pool from the Lincoln Memorial. I bought one of the picnic lunches provided by the Council of Churches. It seemed like a grand picnic. My mother and the rest of the family had found a spot near the front. They saw Dad on the dais with King and the other speakers. At one point, Dad walked out onto the front of the dais and looked out over the crowd. The speakers were great, but when Martin Luther King was introduced, everyone stood up and cheered. They cheered wildly, and I stood up and cheered too. When he said in his deep preacher's voice, I have a dream today, the electricity of his voice, it went across the grass and up my spine and electrified my brain. The power of his voice reached into my soul and charged me with excitement and hope. Dr. King's dream became my dream that day, that we would not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, that we would all sit down together at the table of brotherhood. King was not only a great black man, he was a great American who had the power to inspire the people that he led. The movement had kept building after Montgomery, and in the 1960s, it had really taken off. Starting with the sit-ins, then the freedom rides. These youngsters had to have inner as well as outer discipline to deal with this kind of opposition. Dad helped with their training and realized a book was needed to explain the self-discipline and training required. So he wrote a handbook of his own for the movement. I republished it as it was out of print. This handbook was the first of its kind, and it detailed how to organize nonviolent actions, how to deal with harassment and handle arrest and imprisonment. It was used extensively for the sit-ins, freedom rides, and the '63 March on Washington. Then in '64, the Mississippi Summer Project began, where Northern college kids volunteered to go to Mississippi to register black people to vote. My father was on the staff as a trainer at Oxford, Ohio, who conducted sessions such as you see on the screen. Now, these youngsters are role-playing, going limp, and reacting nonviolently to being mistreated. Now, do these three people here look familiar? Perhaps you older ones in the audience remember these three trainees, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, who were killed by the Klan so soon after the project started. Dad was distraught, wondering if somehow he had failed them. The death of these young men was quite a shock for the nation, but especially for the trainees and trainers. Dad was extremely afraid that the trainees would all quit and go home. But only a few deserted. He was so proud of the young people for sticking with the Freedom Summer Project, writing, "Those kids braved the police, accompanied black people in that long walk to the courthouse to register to vote. They faced the mobs and rebuilt burned-out churches." Now, in 1964, Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his stellar work in using nonviolent direct action, harnessing peaceful means for peaceful ends. Dad wrote, "The fact that Martin Luther King's moral authority reaches beyond the shores of this country is not surprising. Those that advance the cause of freedom and ennoble the human spirit belong to people of all times. Dr. King voices what is deepest in the hearts of those he leads." In 1968, Dad was in charge of planning and conducting all the nonviolence workshops for the Poor People's Campaign. It was Martin Luther King's and Charlie Walker's dream for all races to work together, not just substitute one top dog for another. King even bravely declared, "I believe black supremacy is as dangerous as white supremacy." He believed in the brotherhood of all men. He was never in favor of any type of violence to achieve his ends. And as long as the movement was committed to the principles of nonviolence, it was hugely successful. It made many allies and had numerous victories for mankind. But in the 1960s, King's influence started to decline, and people began talking violent retaliation instead of nonviolence. I too felt sad when people my age started to fall away from that strong commitment. King's assassination in 1968 was one of the worst days of Charlie's life, and mine too. After Reverend King was killed, the huge coalition that he was holding together fell apart, and almost immediately the blacks went into the Black Power movement of the 1970s, and the whites went into the peace movement. Now, the whites felt like they didn't have much choice, but because things were just happening the way they did. Now, my dad loved Dr. King and what he stood for, writing, "Let us be thankful to God for raising up a Martin Luther King to give voice to the power of nonviolence." Now, Reverend King explained when Dad's co-worker, Glenn Smiley, sent King a congratulations letter upon winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And King wrote back, "Your encouraging words and your genuine expressions of confidence give me new determination to carry on the struggle to make the brotherhood of man a reality." And at the ceremony in Sweden, he declared to the whole world, "The beauty of genuine brotherhood and peace is more precious than diamonds or silver or gold." Folks, my parting thought is, let's reopen the dialogue about nonviolent direct action and the principles that it stands upon. It is truly the teachings of Jesus in a practical form. That's what gave it the victory in the past and will give it the wisdom and the power for victory today. Thank you.